It's been a minute, as they say.
So, Bill, you may start whenever you're ready.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning from Home, and welcome to the Hewlett Library's presentation called Gods and Monsters. And let me just do this. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I will be your host today. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. I also return regularly to New York, where I continue my work at the museum and enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, since we can't cover everything about this noon's presentation in one thing here, I'd like to invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, which is makingwings.net. And in this case, it's deeper dive number 2. Now, let me explain this, especially for those of you who this may be your first time. So just go to makingwings.net, and it's one word, Making Wings. And you're going to click on that. And you should be seeing right now on your screen my home page there. And if you go to the upper left corner, this little menu, you're going to see a number of things in the drop down. You can visit any of these, please feel free. You're going to see 2 sections called Deeper Dives. The one you want is in this first bunch. It's going to be number 2. So click on this, just the arrow, not the words, the arrow, downward arrow. Click on that. And again, you're going to see a lot of things in a drop down. These are presentations that I have given or will be given. So for every one that I give, like today, I create a page. And so today's is number 2, Gods and Monsters. And if you click on that, what you'll find on that page is an overview of myths, legends, folk, and fairy tales. You're going to find some recommended media. We're going to talk about that during the presentation. So if you don't have a paper or pencil handy, but a book strikes your fancy, you can go to my webpage and you can copy down authors and titles there. Um, and then I have all kinds of printed web resources here, as well as video resources and web resources on selected stories, archetypes, theme examples. And then we're going to be looking today at 9 specific stories, and I have uh, links for every and all of them. So there's just a lot of stuff on the webpage, and I hope that you can take advantage of that. I always like to start out with this little caveat, and that is everything you hear in the program today uses the web resources and the books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially use the following sources to build its structure and to create the script: the Oxford Companion to World Mythology, the websites study.com and SparkNotes, the website MythBank, Thought Company, and Wikipedia, Britannica, and Mythopedia, which is a wonderful site if you like to pursue this topic, Mythopedia. Now, as you just saw, there was some recommended media. And the absolute golden oldie of all golden oldies is Edith Hamilton's seminal 1942 book, Mythology: Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes. Now, though the text only covers the Greek, Roman, and Norse gods and heroes, it still remains one of the best resources for an understanding of what mythology is all about. Annette Geske's Classical Mythology A to Z, or as my friends north of the border would say, A to Z, It's an encyclopedia of gods, goddesses, heroes and heroines, nymphs, spirits, monsters, and places. How's that for a title? It was published in 2020, and it's really an excellent complement to Hamilton's book because it includes the great monsters and the geographic locations that are so important to myths and legends. Roy Willis's 2006 World Mythology is a beautifully illustrated, alphabetically arranged encyclopedia that includes not only the classic Greek and Roman figures, but as the title states, important characters from around the world. David Leeming's The Oxford Companion to World Mythology is a very well written text. It's an A to Z encyclopedia that has entries on topics as well as personages. So you also get to explore principal themes of myths and legends in this book. Now, if you'd like to explore something that's not Western mythology, then Joan Vernaro's 101 Read Aloud Asian Myths and Legends is the book for you. Now, though it's intended for younger readers, it's a great introduction for readers of any age to stories that, frankly, most of us might not be familiar with. And last but not least, World Mythologies for Beginners by Zachary Hamby, uh, published recently, 2021, is excellent and is one of the major resources for today's presentation. Now, though it's intended as a high school textbook, it's a great read for anyone who wants to learn about myths, legends, and folk tales. Okay, so with all of that said, I'd like to tell you what we're going to be doing today. First, I want to make sure that we understand our terminologies. What exactly do we mean when we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales? Then, I'd like to look at some of the archetypes and themes that appear over and over again around the planet. After that, I'd like to briefly highlight 9 stories that represent the broad range of examples that we find on the 6 populated continents. Sorry, Antarctica, you're left out of the mix, unless you know of any tale-telling penguins or sea lions. And finally, there'll be a chance for you to share and ask questions at the end, and perhaps share a myth, legend, or folktale that's a favorite of yours. So, again, with all of that said, and I was sharing with Marie before, I had so much fun finding the images that I'm using for this presentation. This is some beautiful artwork. We're going to begin with an examination of some terms. Now, the terms myth, legend, folklore, and fairy tale are often used interchangeably, leading to the misconception that they mean the same thing, fanciful tales. Now, although it's true that these terms may refer to bodies of writing that answer some of life's basic questions or present commentary on morality, each type presents a distinct experience for the reader. So, first off, let's talk about myth. What do we mean when we say that something is a myth? Well, first of all, it's a symbolic story concerned with the origins of a people, their world, or natural phenomena. Myths typically take place in the distant past and feature gods, goddesses, and or other supernatural beings as their primary protagonists. Now, while the original adherents of a particular mythology believe them to be true, myths often have little or no basis in historical reality. Now, like folk tales and fairy tales, myths are fictional stories, but instead of existing for mere entertainment, they serve a higher purpose. On one level, they are often sacred rather than secular. To quote folklorist and anthropologist William Bascom, myths are often the embodiment of dogma and are often associated with theology and ritual. But myths are also an early version of, science. They are etiological from the ancient Greek word that means cause. They explain the cause of things, from the origin of the planet Earth to the cause of common natural occurrences like rain, lightning, or volcanoes. And one important thing to remember is that the original form of any myth is always oral. They are told before they are written down by a culture. Finally, many cultures have their own versions of common myths that contain archetypal images and themes. For example, one common myth that spans multiple cultures across the world is that of a great flood. Literally, on every one of the inhabited continents, ancient peoples created flood stories. And often with boats and animals and so forth. So it's very interesting. That's kind of in our DNA to create these kinds of stories. Well, how is that different from a legend? Now, unlike myth, which is usually set in distant times, a legend is a heroic story, usually, and I underline the word usually, set in the more recent past. That is, popularly considered historical, but remains unverifiable. So it straddles the line between sacred and secular. Legends don't usually have religious significance, but often have natural or cultural significance, such as King Arthur and Robin Hood for the British, or William Tell for the Swiss, and the Trojan War for the Greeks and the Romans. Legends may be based on historical figures, but the actual adventures of those figures, the ones that they partake in, are often fictionalized or exaggerated. Legends are, frankly, usually built on hyperbole, exaggeration. The bottom line is that if many myths, especially etiological myths, are a form of early science, then legends are a form of early history. The word legend also refers to anything that inspires a body of stories or anything of lasting importance or fame. The story is handed down orally, but continues to evolve with time. Much of early literature began as legends that were told and retold in epic poems that were originally passed down orally and then, at some point, written down. And these include masterpieces such as the Greek Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, created around 800 BCE, and the great French epic about Charlemagne called Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, finally written down about 1100 of the Common Era, which was 3 full centuries after Charlemagne's death. That's a lot of time to embellish a tale. Now, next up, we have that word folktales. A folktale is a secular, fictional story that is passed down orally and then later in written form, usually among common people. By the way, are you seeing a theme here? Almost all stories, whether it's a myth, a fairy tale, a legend, uh, they start initially being told, kind of a campfire story, if you will. Now, unlike myths and legends, which tended to be created by and for priests and the nobility, folk tales are not considered sacred or truthful by storytellers or story listeners, and are usually told solely for entertainment's sake. Furthermore, folk tales are often described as timeless and placeless, meaning you can change a folktale setting from past to present or vice versa, and or from this land to that land without losing the essence of the narrative. Now, this fluidity and adaptability of folk tales further distinguish them from other story categories because myths, and to an extent legends, tend to have not only fixed settings, but also fixed meanings. Now, other aspects of folklore include superstition or unfounded beliefs. They may also have moral messages relevant to the culture in which the tale is created. Hence, many folk tales include that famous phrase, and the moral of the story is. Now, one intriguing genre of folk tale is the fable, in which animals are the primary characters. Some of the earliest were written down in ancient Greece by Aesop, but the genre continues to this day. George Orwell's Animal Farm, for example, is a prime type of modern fable. Orwell's work, however, did not begin as part of an oral tradition. Rather, it is an original work created by an author. Thus, Orwell's novel is what's called a literary folk tale, while a story like, oh, let's say The Tortoise and the Hare is an oral folk tale. It started out many, many years ago, first told, as I say, kind of around the campfire. Now, a fairy tale is a secular fictional story, often geared towards children, that features fantastical lands, forces, or characters such as fairies, elves, goblins, trolls, giants, dragons, and wizards. Fairy tales are kind of a subgenre of the folk tale. They do not necessarily need to feature fairies in order to earn its classification, but it does require a happy or a just ending or a turn, hence the expression a fairy tale ending. According to Hobbit and Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien, a defining characteristic of the fairy tale is that it transports readers and listeners to an alternative, but still rational and consistent world that operates under a different set of rules from our own world. The purpose of this transportation, however, is not simply to escape from the cruelties of the real world, but to gain perspective and to inspire hope. In a fairy tale, goodness is rewarded and evil is vanquished. Now, in the 20th century, many old fairy tales have been uh, what many people lovingly call Disneyfied, to be less sinister and to appeal to young children. These stories have taken on lives of their own. In fact, many classic and contemporary books, such as Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and Snow White, are based on fairy tales from much earlier times. But if you were to read the original mid-19th century, for example, Grimm Brothers fairy tales, you'd be surprised at the endings and how they differ from the versions that you may have grown up with. In Grimm, for example, the evil stepsisters of Cinderella have their eyes plucked out by birds at Cinderella's triumphant wedding. And the wicked stepmother in Snow White is forced to dance herself to death in a pair of blazing hot iron slippers at Snow White's wedding to the prince. Now, those endings, believe it or not, would have been considered happy or just by both the writers and the European society in which those stories emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries. The heroines are rewarded with traditional marriages, but the villains are vigorously punished. So, if we were to summarize this chart from the wonderful website irishmyths.com, is very helpful. At the top, you see the term sacred. These are symbolic stories, myths, passed down usually by religious leaders and concern the origins of people, the world, and natural phenomena. As the clover in the upper corner shows, these kinds of narratives, always oral in origin before getting written down, are myths. As we move down to the middle of the screen, we see the word legends. Now, these stories are usually based on historical figures, such as famous warriors or kings, but often contain fictional elements that those heroes must overcome, fight, or deal with, including deities, monsters, fairies, etc., etc. And at the bottom of your screen, you see the word secular. Folk and fairy tales are entertaining fictional stories passed down by common people and concern the events and conflicts of everyday people. Literary tales are invented by an author like L. Frank Baum, for example, the Oz stories, or Hans Christian Andersen, the Nutcracker. On the other hand, traditional tales are oral and are stories that are eventually written down by writers like the Grimm brothers. Now, here's another way of looking at these narratives. On the top, you see the phrase story meaning. Myths represented by the green bar tend to be more symbolic, while folk and fairy tales, represented by the yellow bar, tend to be more literal, even if they contain supernatural beings like fairy godmothers. Their meaning is literal, even if their content is imaginary. Now, at the bottom of the slide, you see the term story setting. In the case of myths, the green bar, the setting is usually in the past. Legends, the blue bar, tend to deal with historical events and personages that are more recent. But folk and fairy tales, that's the yellow line, as we've already suggested, have the advantage of being adaptable to any time and setting. For example, one of the most often retold stories around the world is that of Cinderella, from classic films like Pretty Woman to young adult novels like Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. Now, frankly, the lines among these genres often gets blurred, especially in recent times. Think of the Marvel comic stories about Thor or the DC comic stories about the Justice League or Superman. In them, elements of literary myth, legend, and fairy tale have been mixed, and some of those elements include common themes and archetypes. Common themes, topics, and characters that appear primarily in myths and legends, but can certainly appear in folk and fairy tales, are mighty heroes like Odysseus, terrifying monsters like Medusa, gods or gods and goddesses, natural disasters like floods or fire, the afterlife, Egyptian mythology being a superb example, tricksters like Loki, Kokopelli, or the brave little tailor, and transformation and incarnation, including stories about Osiris, skinwalkers, or werewolves. Over and over, you see these and many other themes, topics, and characters and stories from around the world. They are, to use Carl Jung's phrase, part of our collective unconscious. Every culture has tales of heroes, divinities, and natural disasters like a worldwide flood created independently across the planet. We seem to be hardwired to create these universal narratives. Further, if myths, legends, and folk tales contain common characters and elements, they also have related archetypes, including the ally, such as Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu, the mentor, such as Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars saga, the supernatural benefactor, such as the fairy godmother in certain versions of Cinderella, or the wicked step-parents, such as the Queen in Snow White and in countless other folk and fairy tales. Well, with all of that under our collective belts, let's look at how these definitions and examples play out in 9 narratives from around the world. We're going to briefly highlight these stories. Prometheus, which is an etiological myth from Greece. Arachne, an etiological myth from Rome. The Bull of Heaven, a legend from the Middle East. Li Chi, the Serpent Slayer, a folk tale from China. Thor, a myth from Scandinavia. Alatangana, a creation myth from the Kono people of West Africa. Quetzalcoatl, a story from Mesoamerica. And we have Sedna, an etiological myth of the Inuit people of northern Canada. And last but not least, the Taming of Kinegare, a folktale told by the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. Now, I wish I had time to include many more stories from the Middle East, Asia, South America, from the Indians of North and South America, and the water-faring tribes of Oceania. But I've given you some links to those cultures on my website, and hope you can take advantage of that. Okay, let's begin our little hit parade here of stories. First up is the myth of Prometheus, an etiological story that explains how human beings got the game-changing gift of fire. Now, in some traditions of the creation of humanity, it is the Titan Prometheus, whose name means forethought, who made the first humans from clay. While in other versions of the creation story, all the gods made the creatures of earth. Now, in some versions of the myth, Prometheus and his brother Epithaeus, whose name means afterthought, were given the task of endowing all the creatures of earth with gifts so that they might survive and prosper. Epithaeus liberally spread around such gifts as fur and wings, but by the time he got around to humans, he had run out of gifts. Well, feeling sorry for humanity's weak and naked state, Prometheus raided the workshop of Hephaestus and Athena on Mount Olympus. And he stole fire and gave the valuable gift to humans, which would help them in life's struggles. The Titan also taught humans how to use their gift, and as a result, the skill of metalwork began. Over time, Prometheus also came to be associated with science and culture. Well, meanwhile, Zeus was outraged by Prometheus's theft of fire and gave the Titan an eternal punishment by having him taken far to the Caucasus Mountains in the east. There, east of Greece, of course, there Prometheus was chained to a rock, and Zeus sent an eagle to eat the Titan's immortal liver. Even worse, the liver regrew each night, and the eagle returned each day to perpetually torment Prometheus. Fortunately for Prometheus, but only after many years, the hero Heracles, sometimes known as Hercules, passed by one day during his celebrated labors and killed the eagle with one of his arrows, and Prometheus was relieved of his torment. As for humans, in one version of the story by the Greek poet Hesiod, Zeus punished the man for receiving the fire by instructing Hephaestus to create from clay the first woman, whose name was Pandora. And through her, all the negative aspects of life would befall humankind: work, illness, war, death, and most tragically, perhaps, their separation from the gods. So if the Prometheus myth from Greece explains how humans achieved the use of fire, the Roman myth of Arachne explains the origins of spiders and their webs. First handed down in an oral tradition in ancient Greece, it was the epic poem of the Metamorphosis that the Roman poet Ovid first wrote down the tale as we know it today. It goes like this. Arachne was a shepherd's daughter who began weaving at an early age. She became such a great weaver that she boasted that her skill was greater than that of the goddess Minerva, and refused to acknowledge that her skill came, at least in part, from that goddess. Well, Minerva, seen on your left, took offense and set up a contest between them. Presenting herself as an old lady, she approached the boasting girl and warned, "You can never compare to any of the gods. Plead for forgiveness, and Minerva might spare your soul." "Ha! I only speak the truth," Arachne declared. "And if Minerva thinks otherwise, then let her come down and challenge me herself." Well, Minerva removed her disguise of the old woman and appeared in shimmering glory as the goddess of wisdom, justice, law, victory, and the sponsor of the arts and trade. The two began weaving straight away. Minerva's tapestry depicted ways in which the gods punish mortals for setting themselves as equal to the gods. Arachne's tapestry, well, her weaving showed ways that the gods, particularly Jupiter, had misled and abused mortals, tricking and subduing many women. Ovid tells us when Minerva saw that Arachne had not only insulted the gods, but had done so with a work far more beautiful than Minerva's own, well, she was enraged. She ripped Arachne's work to shreds and knocked her to the ground. Terrified and ashamed, Arachne hanged herself. But, according to Ovid, Minerva relented a bit and said, "Live on, condemned one, but lest you are careless in the future, I curse you and your descendants to the last generation." After saying this, she sprinkled Arachne with a magical herb, and immediately Arachne's hair fell out. With it went her nose and ears, then her head shrank to the smallest size, and her whole body became tiny. Her slender fingers stuck to her sides as legs, and the rest became a belly from which she still spins a thread, and, as a spider, to this day, weaves her remarkable ancient webs. Thus, this story becomes an etiological myth that explains the origin of spiders and webs. Well, from classical mythology, let's enter the realm of legend. One of the earliest extant pieces of world literature is the ancient Sumerian epic Gilgamesh, which, in part, not only tells the story of one of the first leaders of Middle Eastern civilization, but also recounts stories about the creation of the world and the universal flood. So, the epic Gilgamesh is legendary in the sense that it tells about an actual kingdom and one of its early rulers, but also has a strong undercurrent of mythology and mythological archetypes. Let's look at the story of the Bull of Heaven. In ancient Mesopotamian mythology, the Bull of Heaven is a fearsome beast who fights with the historically based hero Gilgamesh. The story of the Bull of Heaven has two different versions. One is the Sumerian version. The other is a later version of the Epic of Gilgamesh written down by the Akkadians. Now, in the Sumerian poem, The bull is sent to attack Gilgamesh by the goddess excuse me, for reasons that are unclear. The more complete Akkadian account comes from tablet 6 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you could see that on your screen. And by the way, note that these wonderful tablets that we have from ancient civilizations in the Middle East are very small. And all of that writing is called cuneiform, and it's really the first example of written language, certainly in the Western world. Well, in the version that is on that tablet, number 6, Gilgamesh refuses the sexual advantages of the goddess Ishtar. The enraged goddess demands that her father, Anu, gives her the bull of heaven so that she may send it to attack Gilgamesh. Anu grants her wish, and she sends it to attack Gilgamesh and his companion, the hero Enkidu, who together slay the bull. After defeating the bull, Enkidu, and you may sometimes hear it, by the way, pronounced Enkidu. Take your pick. I go with Enkidu. After defeating the bull, Enkidu hurls the bull's right thigh at Ishtar, taunting her. The slaying of the bull results in the gods condemning Enkidu to death, an event which tears apart Gilgamesh emotionally and catalyzes his fear for his own death, a fear that drives the remaining portion of the poem, namely Gilgamesh's search for immortality. Now, since ancient times, the bull was identified with the constellation Taurus, and the myth of its slaying may have held astronomical significance to the ancient Mesopotamians. So the legendary Gilgamesh and mythological bull become the backdrop for lessons about jealousy, friendship, and love. Oh, why don't we fly off and go to the east and visit China, where we can hear the folktale called Li Chi, the Serpent Slayer. It's a folktale because it is not about a god or a superhuman hero. It's about a common everyday person who rises to a great challenge and becomes a hero in the process. Now, there are countless tales of dragon slaying from around the world, including the story of St. George in England and Siegfried in the German and Scandinavian countries. There are countless dragon stories in China where dragons hold a special place in cultural and religious ceremonies, such as Chinese New Year celebrations. This folktale, however, fine-tunes the focus. In this narrative, a serpent takes the place of the dragon. In fact, according to researchers, ancient Chinese scholars once associated some cultures in Southeast Asia near Hong Kong with snakes. Further, which is further reinforced by the fact that folktales collected in this region show snakes as vicious enemies to be vanquished, as opposed to dragons, which in some regions are seen as symbols of good fortune and power. Now, Li Chi's story goes like this. In the mountains of southeast China, there lived a serpent that demanded the sacrifice of a maiden from one of the local villages. Otherwise, if denied, the serpent would curse the region with all sorts of calamities. Well, officials, afraid of the creature, give in to its horrible request and send a maiden to the cave's opening. Now, in some versions, they are the daughters of slaves and criminals. Now, these sacrifices repeat 8 more times, always during the first week of the 8th lunar month. Well, one day, Li Chi, the youngest daughter of Li Tan, offers herself to be the sacrifice. Why? Because her mother and father have five other daughters and no son, thus making her, quote unquote, expendable. She goes to the mountains to face the serpent, armed with a sword and accompanied by a snake-biting dog. Well, Li Chi puts a basket of sweet-smelling rice cakes to draw the serpent out of its hideout. And while it is distracted by the food, unleashes the dog on the animal. The serpent retreats to the cave, but the girl follows after it, always hitting and striking its body with the sword until it dies. Li Chi sees the skeleton of the previous sacrificed maidens and laments that they were devoured by the beast. Now, in some variations of this legend, the king learns of Li Chi's bravery and he marries her. In another version, the king also rewards her father with the position of magistrate of the district. And in yet a third version, the king offers her father the position of governor of the whole province. But in all of these versions, in other words, there is the happy resolution that J.R.R. Tolkien says is part of every folk and fairy tale. Now, some scholars interpret this folk tale as a contrast of Li Chi's bravery and the ineffectiveness of the male village officers who preferred to obey the serpent instead of trying to fight it. Scholars also suggest that the snake foe, a python with supernatural powers in some accounts, may represent an old local deity with serpentine form. And the sacrifice of the virginal maidens merits comparison to stories about fertility rites that you can find around the world. As new belief systems were being diffused through the country during the medieval period, the old animal-shaped divinities were subjected to a process of religious reformation that demoted them to adversarial roles of the newcomer human-like deities. Meaning that in China and elsewhere, um, animal deities slowly but surely became replaced by deities that look more like us. Okay, let's head back to Europe, specifically Northern Europe, for a visit with the thunder god Thor, who has a day of the week named after him, Thor's Day or Thursday. Now, as you're probably aware, there are several Marvel Comics films about the god, with Chris Hemsworth playing Thor. Thor appears throughout Norse mythology, largely recorded in written form in Iceland from traditional materials stemming from Scandinavia. These Icelandic sagas provide numerous tales featuring the god Thor. In these sources, Thor is the husband of the golden-haired goddess Sif. He is also the lover of the giantess Jarnsaxa and is generally described as fierce-eyed with red hair and a red beard. With Sif and Jarnsaxa, among others, he fathers numerous children, including at least one of the famous women warriors known as Valkyries. And in some versions, that is a Valkyrie named Brunhilde. Now, by way of Odin, Thor has numerous brothers, including Balder, who is the god of light, wisdom, and courage, best known for his dramatic death, which heralds the coming of Ragnarok, the end of the age of the Norse gods and the rebirth of the world. Thor rides in a chariot pulled by two goats, Tangrisnir and Tangnostir, whom he, in some versions, seems to eat and then resurrects several times. Most importantly, though, in almost all versions, Thor wields the mighty hammer Mjolnir. Thor's exploits include his relentless slaughter of foes and fierce battles with the monstrous serpent Jormungandr. Now, although Marvel Comics might have you believe otherwise, Thor and the trickster god Loki were not half brothers, although it's easy to see how the pair could have been, since the great Icelandic sagas often pair their adventures together. And here's one version from the Icelandic sagas, a very famous version, that recounts how the bored and mischievous Loki decided to wind up Thor by cutting off his wife Sif's hair. She was the golden-haired goddess of earth and harvest. Well, one day, while she slept, Loki crept up, lopped off her famous golden locks. Well, when Thor found out what had happened, well, he was less than amused. With a rampaging god of thunder looming down upon him, Loki decided, well, it's best he make amends. So Thor agrees, and Loki descends beneath the earth to find dwarves famous for their craftsmanship abilities. Besides returning with a headdress of golden hair for Sif, Loki also returns with Mjolnir that becomes Thor's famous weapon. Now, the story of Sif's golden locks and Thor's hammer Mjolnir ends up being, in part, an etiological myth that explains the origin of the natural event called thunder. But this and other stories also underscore the fact that Thor is the defender of Asgard, the realm of the gods, and Midgard, the human realm. And much of that defense relies on the mythical power of the great hammer, Mjolnir. Well, from the wintry realms of Iceland and Norway, we go to the tropical heat of West Africa. Now, one of the most important creation myths of the region is that of Alatagana, who was known as Life, and Sa, S-A, also known as Death. It's short enough. I'm going to read it to you, so please feel free to follow along as I read this traditional oral tale, one that is still being recited among the Kono people of Sierra Leone today. Sa, his wife and daughter, were the only beings in the created world, which was a formless void known as the Great Empty. They lived on top of a muddy river in a hut. One day, Alatagana showed up and, using his magic, made the mud river firm. This is what we call Earth. Alatagana then chanted and made plants to cover the earth. This is why we have vegetation. Alatagana then chanted and made fish and birds and animals to fill the waters, the skies, and the earth. And this is why we have animal life. As a result of all this, Sa invited Alatagana into his house, where, over time, Alatagana fell in love with Sa's daughter. Now, on 3 different occasions, he asked Sa if he could marry her, and each time Sa said no. In fact, on the last occasion, Sa told Alatagana that he'd outstayed his welcome and ordered him to leave. Well, when death arose, Alatagana was gone, but so was his beloved daughter. They had fled to a distant corner of the world. There, they started their own family and had 7 daughters and 7 sons. However, each child was a different color, and though they were happy, they all spoke different languages. languages that their parents could not understand. They couldn't comprehend them. Well, Alatangana decided to seek out his father-in-law, Death, for advice. Sa said, I cursed you for stealing my daughter. Now your children will scatter across the world, all with different colors and different tongues. Now leave here before I curse you again. Well, in time, some of Alatagana's children came home to visit with a singular pain. There was no light. The sun as we know it did not exist. Their father tried all the spells and incantations, all to no avail. He knew he had to consult Sa, but instead of going directly, Alatagana sent two messengers, a rooster and a small toucan bird. Sa invited these birds into his house and taught them the songs required to bring forth daylight before sending them on their way. When the birds returned to Alatagana, he was infuriated because he thought Sa was deceiving him. He started thrashing the birds, almost killing them. However, at the last moment, he spared them and threw them out of his house. At a safe distance, the birds began to sing, and by doing so, they ushered in the very first dawn. Sunrise had arrived for the human race. Well, Alatagana was ashamed, and that's when death showed up. As payment for all I have done for you, Sa said, whenever I want, whenever I need, whenever I choose, I can come to claim any of your children, your children's children, and their children until the end of time. Solemnly, Alatagana, father of humanity, nodded in acceptance, and that is how death entered the world. Yet, ah, there's always a rooster waiting to bring the new day and usher in new life. Well, in the end, this particularly rich etiological myth covers so much territory, including the formation of Earth, the creation of plants and animals, the origin of racial colors and social languages, not to mention the creation of sunrise and the origin of death. Okay, now we're going to take some flight over to the New World, and we're going to focus on the story of Quetzalcoatl, a myth and legend from the Aztec people of what is today central Mexico. Quetzalcoatl, or plumed serpent, was a mix of bird and rattlesnake, and was the god of winds and rain, and the creator of the world and humanity. As deity, cultural hero, or legendary ruler, Quetzalcoatl appears in many of the region's most powerful and enduring stories. He represents life, motion, laughter, health, sexuality, and the arts and crafts of civilization, such as farming, cooking, and music. His very name brings together the magnificent green-plumed Quetzal bird, who symbolizes the heavens and the winds, and the snake, who symbolizes the earth and fertility. So he's a blend of these two creatures. Quetzalcoatl occupied a central place in the pantheon of the Aztec people of central Mexico, but he dates back to a time long before the Aztecs, to the Toltecs, seen on the map on your screen in yellows, who flourished in the region from the 800s to the 1100s. Quetzalcoatl was the deity of the morning and evening stars, as well as the wind. When the Aztecs, seen on the map in lavender, rose to power in the 1300s, they brought Quetzalcoatl into their pantheon and made him a cultural hero, a bringer not just of life, but also of civilization. Now, these old myths merge with legends about a priest king named Quetzalcoatl, who was probably a real historical figure. As groups from central Mexico migrated into the Yucatan Peninsula, they blended with the pre-existing, much older Mayan civilization seen on the map in dark green. It was there that the feathered serpent took his place in the Mayan pantheon under the name of Kukulkan. Bottom line, Quetzalcoatl was a central figure in the three major Mexican civilizations for hundreds of years and remains important as a popular cultural influence to this day. Besides creating humans, Quetzalcoatl also protected and helped them. Some myths say that he introduced the cultivation of maize or corn, the staple product of Mexico. He did this by disguising himself as a black ant and stealing the precious grain from angry red ants. He also taught people astronomy, calendar making, and various crafts, and was patron of merchants. Carlos Fuentes, one of modern Mexico's leading writers, compares Quetzalcoatl with the mythic figures Prometheus and Odysseus and the legendary Moses. All three of them had to leave their cultures, but were able to obtain gifts or wisdom that renewed those cultures. And now we fly to the northern reaches of Canada to visit the Inuit peoples and their myth about Sedna. She is the goddess of the sea and marine animals in Inuit mythology and is sometimes called the mother of the sea. In one version of this etiological myth, Sedna is a giant, the daughter of the creator god Anguta, with a great hunger that causes her to attack her parents. Angered, Anguta takes her out to sea and throws her over the side of his kayak. As she clings to the sides, he chops off her fingers and she sinks to the underworld, becoming the ruler of the monsters of the deep. Her huge severed fingers become the seals, walruses, and whales hunted by the Inuit. In another version of the legend, she is dissatisfied with men found for her by her father, and so she marries a dog. Now, her father is so angry at this that he throws her into the sea, and when she tries to climb back into the boat, he cuts off her fingers. And, as in other versions, her severed fingers become the first seals, and she becomes a mighty sea goddess. When she is angered, a shaman travels to wash and comb Sedna's hair, after which she is placated and she releases the animals to the hunters. And in still other versions, she is unable to comb her hair because she lacks fingers, so a shaman must brush it for her. Other versions of the legend depict Sedna as a beautiful maiden who rejects marriage proposals from the hunters of her village. When an unknown hunter appears, Sedna's father agrees to give her to him as wife in return for fish. Sedna's father gives Sedna a sleeping potion and gives her to the hunter, who takes her to a large nest on a cliff, where he reveals his true form, a great bird spirit. She wakes surrounded by birds. Her father attempts to rescue her, but the bird spirit becomes angry, causing a great storm. In desperation, Sedna's father throws her into the raging sea. And in a variation of the story, when she attempts to cling to the kayak, her hands freeze and her fingers fall off, becoming the creatures of the sea. And she descends to the bottom of the ocean and grows a fishtail. So in each version of the myth, her father takes her to the sea in his kayak, and in each her fingers become pinnipeds like sea lions and seals. Further, in each iteration, she sinks to the bottom of the sea, where she becomes a goddess of the realm. Ultimately, she's worshipped by hunters who depend on her goodwill to supply food. She is generally considered a vengeful goddess, mainly because she has serious anger issues, and especially regarding her father's treatment of her in most versions of the story. And hunters must placate her and pray to her to release the sea animals from the ocean depths for their hunt. Depending on her mood and the strength of their prayers, she usually obliges. And last but not least, our number 9 tale, we take a brief look at a folk tale from Aboriginal Australia called The Taming of Cynegare. The Cynegare is a monster found in Aboriginal oral folklore. It's described as a ruthless killer with the head of a rat, but with the body of a man. In the oldest of the tales, he wanders around killing innocent people, birds, and other animals, and is the terror of the bush country. Well, in one version of the story, after a particularly terrorizing attack at a watering hole, the creature is finally ambushed and defeated by a wise and courageous owl and his crow friend. After the defeat, the owl and the crow burn the monster's body, and as they do, a large spark floats out of the fire and takes its place as a star in the Milky Way. All that remains on the ground is a pile of ash. But the next day, when the animals return to the watering hole to see the remains, they are terrified when they see foot tracks coming out from the dusty remains. Some animals follow the tracks and discover a little creature with rat-like face. Instead of a large monster, they discover a quoll, a small carnivorous marsupial, a final remnant of the mighty monster. Now, this particular tale is one that blends two traditions. On the one hand, it can be seen as an etiological myth explaining the origin of the real-life mammal called a quoll. But it's also clearly a folk tale that has animals as the main characters and is meant to be kind of a spooky and entertaining campfire story. And that is one of the important points of today's presentation. While myths, legends, and folktales are three distinct genres, in some stories, there are elements of all three. Well, whew, there you have it. 9 wonderful examples of myths, legends, and folktales from around the world. For many of us, myths and legends are stories from the Bible, Greece, and Rome, and Germanic and Scandinavian cultures that were taught to us as kids. And our knowledge of folk and fairy tales is probably limited to the Grimm's, Hans Christian Andersen, and or Disney adaptations. But I hope today's program has whet your appetite to look beyond the staple war horses we grew up with and explore the myths, legends, and folk tales that every other culture on Earth has developed. And what becomes fascinating is how each of those cultures have often created nearly identical narratives independently of each other. Some stories, some characters, and some archetypes are truly universal. Every culture has a god of thunder or love. Every culture has a bringer of fire or floods. Every culture has etiological tales that explain the origin of natural phenomena. Every culture has stories of serpents and dragons or other monstrous beings. In other words, it's hardwired into our psyches. Storytelling is in our genes. So, please feel free to visit my website, makingwings.net, and take Deeper dive number two to start your exploration of all those other remarkable stories from around the world. And now, before we talk about our next episode, it's time to explore some of your thoughts and ideas, including maybe some of your favorite stories.